PlexTrack is the platform that guides the healthy collaboration of red and blue teams to get the daily security work done. Red teams can create reports in half the time and track risk to resolution with the blue team. Blue teams can centralize remediation efforts across all scans, assessments, and audits through simple visualizations of risk, scanner, and ticketing integrations. Enhanced analytics allow you to effectively communicate risk in real time. PlexTrack is perfect for remote collaboration across all teams. Visit securityweekly.com/PlexTrack to claim your free month today. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. We are looking for high-quality guest suggestions for our Enterprise Security Weekly podcast. And fill out our guest request form at securityweekly.com/guest. If you know people or you are a person who is doing outstanding things on the blue team for enterprises, we definitely want to hear from you. And I think I have a whole newfound respect for those working the blue team, especially with Microsoft Windows operating systems, as it took my oldest son mere probably minutes to infect my Windows gaming PC with malware that forced a format and reinstall of the operating system. It's interesting. That's a great segue into my article number 6, which will also give you kind of a newfound respect for Microsoft and the Windows operating system. So at Microsoft, 47,000 developers generate nearly 30,000 bugs a month. Now, I'm one developer in one application, and I'm probably at like 15,000 bugs a month. So that's interesting.
Come on, you don't write that much code. There's no way.
No way. Maybe that many bugs, but not that much code.
You write 15,000 lines of code a month, meaning 15,000 bugs?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, I guess proportionally, right? We could do right? So they also say these items get stored across over 100 Azure DevOps and GitHub repositories. So think about that for a moment. To better label and prioritize bugs at scale, they say we couldn't just apply more people at the problem. However, large volumes of semi-curated data are perfect for machine learning. Since 2001, Microsoft has collected 13 million work items and bugs. They say we've used that data to develop a process and machine learning model that correctly distinguishes between security and non-security bugs 99% of the time and accurately identifies critical high-priority security bugs 97% of the time. To me, those statistics were exactly tied, right? Like, amazing. I want to know how many lines of code are written at Microsoft every day by 47,000 developers, right? It's obviously some multiple of, maybe not all 47,000 are writing code every day. I mean, I'm sure you take a day, people take vacation. There might be days where you spend, hopefully there are days when you spend designing write code, right? Not necessarily developing, right? And things like that. But those are staggering numbers if you think of the scale at which they have to secure software and their methodology for using machine learning to produce those accurate results is extremely impressive, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of that's even more optimized code. You think about the rewrite of the whole kernel and OS for the Windows 10 stuff, and you're talking about like a massive underhaul that optimized all the code, refashioned it, made it much more secure. I can't even imagine having to I would love to see what their DevOps process is and kind of how they prioritize both the security vulnerabilities and the code that they're looking at, and then how they're actually testing that. Like, obviously the AI stuff's one bit, but they're going to have to put eyes on that. And then how do they go about looking for those bugs and replicating them, right?
Right.
And then
you got me thinking
cloud infrastructure and all that.
What is the process behind 47,000 developers writing code every day? Like that is just mind-boggling, right? So many questions. Like, that is just mind-boggling. That's I had never put it in that context, and when I found that quote, I thought it was really cool.
It's where Scrum Masters come from.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that, as much as we want to pick on some of the, things that happen in Microsoft code, when you put it in this context, 47,000 developers writing code, and then you look at the issues that they've had and the vulnerabilities, they're doing a good job, right? I mean, they haven't always been that forward thinking with security and in quality of code, certainly, right? But in their maturity in the past 20 years, certainly, they've done an amazing job, in my opinion. When you add in all of these variables, pun intended, they're doing a fantastic job. Jeff.
Yeah, huge product line. You've got Active Directory, you've got enterprise scalability, you've got Office, the entire Office suite, and you add in any of the enterprise teams. Like I can't imagine.
Xbox. I wonder that probably includes Xbox too, right? Yep.
So, question,
Jeff.
I mean, I'm looking at the raw numbers: 47,000 developers, 30,000 bugs a month. That means 2/3 of the developers produce 1 bug a month. I think that's amazingly good. My question is, reading, the rest of your summary of the article, are they referring to bugs that, I guess, get published after all this other stuff that they do with AI and scrubbing? Those are what's left? Or are 30,000 bugs or what they're discovering sort of going into this process of trying to scrub and identify them? Do you understand my question?
No, it's a great point, Jeff. A bug is only a bug once you found it, right? And at what point are they finding it, and how are they finding it? In that process, and then if someone after release reports a bug, is that counted in that 30,000? It's a fantastic question.
Well, I guess the 30,000 is it before or after all the rest of what they're doing? And I don't know if that's good or not. Are they? It's hard to interpret, and I haven't looked at the article. I'm just looking at
point in time, right? Like, is it pre-release, post-release? Is it beta testing? Like, at what point is a bug a bug according to their statistic they list here?
Well, I mean, there's something about 97% of the time they're finding the criticals, and 99% of the time they're distinguishing between security and non-security. Does that mean is 30,000 the 1 or the 3%? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean,
maybe I'll have to read the article.
Yeah. And the nice part about Microsoft too is they're really transparent and easy to work with. So to get folks on that can speak to some of this, my guess in working with Microsoft in this capacity is they would be totally open to having people come on and talk about their software security program. So we should do that.
Yeah. Interesting numbers.
It just along the lines and kind of a nice segue from this. I'm kind of picking on enterprises a little bit here, and this is kind of a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, right? My story number one was basically a business article, right? Zoom's a publicly traded company. This was very much from an outlet that was talking about the market, and state that Zoom has been dropped by big businesses despite Zoom addressing these security flaws. And, there's a list of big companies in this article. Certainly they talk about Ericsson. They talk about NXP Semiconductor, Bank of America, and other large companies like Tesla that have come out and said, like, basically, Zoom is a no-go. We're not using Zoom because of reasons. My can kind of pick on this in terms of just maintaining an enterprise level security program, and let's make this specific to enterprises. How many of these very same companies that have come out and stated, and that's not the complete list, right? There are large enterprise companies that have come out and said, Zoom, nope, not happening. But how many of these companies run outdated versions of Internet Explorer, run Adobe Flash, PHP, vulnerable Apache Tomcat, and run Windows versions prior to Windows 10.
I was going to say Windows 2000.
Right? And so to come out and say, oh, wait, Zoom is really bad, And I think that really that's a lame PR attempt to make the public think that they are proactive about security and really truly care about security, when it's really like, oh, look at us, like we won't run vulnerable software, which really, when you get down to it, to dispel that PR campaign, that's not as impactful as you think. Like, we're not going to run vulnerable software, but we are running vulnerable software, but not the vulnerable software that's in the news that everyone is talking about, right?
Right. Yeah, Paul. So you asked a question. Of all of these companies that are saying this stuff, how many of them are running these vulnerable software? And I'd argue there's probably one of them in the list.
Yeah, I agree.
That says we're not running it.
I agree. Probably isn't. I'll say it because many of us, others on this show and in our circle can't.
Our listeners,
right? I will say it's probably Bank of America that I would put as an exclusion to this, that is doing a fantastic job with security. Maybe not. I don't know.
No, I would argue that of those, the ones that just you listed, Tesla was probably the one, and that they probably have the most modern infrastructure just because they're such a newer company.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I was giving Bank of America the benefit of the doubt because I do know people that work.
Bank of America ATM, right?
I know people that work there, and
me too.
Their security program is solid, and so likely those items that I listed, those teams are on top of that shit, right? As much as they can be. That's not to say in such a large company that there's outliers, right? And that's what folks that we know, and I won't speak for you folks, right? But folks that I know that do pen testing can talk about those big companies that, even though they have a really awesome security team and really good security practices, when you get across a threshold in size of organization, it's really hard to say there's no outdated version of Internet Explorer that's running somewhere in my environment, right? And so I still think that the statement publicly that we are not going to use Zoom is a public relations thing, not a testament to their security program.
So,
it's a public relations thing. Sorry, it's public relations thing. It's a marketing thing. The old saying, "There's no such thing as bad press,
right?
Bad reporting." Right. I'm curious. I mean, we use Zoom for our show. Most of our guests come in on Zoom. Are we paying for that service?
We do have a commercial Zoom account.
Okay.
That we use.
So the 300 million daily participants that they're talking about, that Zoom is just reached this milestone. How many of those are paid customers? I mean, obviously, people that are logging on aren't necessarily paying for it. It's whoever's sponsoring the call. But I gotta think that Zoom is not totally unhappy with this reporting, because it's still getting their name in the news. Oh, that Zoom, we should check it out.
I agree. And what many outside of technology, and specifically this technology, may not be aware of, people think of Zoom as, oh, it's the free conference software that I use. Zoom has webcast software. They have meeting software that you can purchase to conduct meetings within the organization. So they have both a commercial consumer offering and a commercial enterprise offering, right? So there's many different aspects to Zoom's business. We've always been of the opinion that Zoom makes great software. I think they're making great strides in terms of security, which is another reason why I think other companies coming out and saying, well, we're not going to run Zoom because of all the stuff that's happened recently is really largely unfounded, and not what it means to have a really, truly great security program is to just exclude software. If you have a truly great security program, you don't trust any software, right? And you have measures in place to protect yourselves, because you know that any piece of software that you run could have vulnerabilities that you know about and ones that you don't know about, and you have to account for that.
Yeah, Paul, I think
hold on, Larry.
One little case study for you. That we talk about, folks. No, we can't use Zoom. We had an incident come up today that one of our teachers for our kids said, "Hey, so one of the parents has asked if everybody can get together via Zoom." And we've been advised by the school that we shouldn't use Zoom. So if you want to do this, please send an email to the parent and this is completely voluntary. You name it, you go here and you can use Zoom if you want to, but we're recommending that you don't use it. But in the same school district, by the same superintendent, the middle school is using Zoom to conduct all of their classrooms.
Right.
It's like,
but now, I mean, let's talk about alternatives. Like, I'm also okay if small business, large enterprise, doesn't matter. If you as an organization have said, this is the video teleconferencing platform of choice, and we've put our resources behind making it available and securing it to the best of our abilities, then you should not use Zoom because we make this available and it's a viable alternative that we support. In the case of schools, Larry, as many of us know, many of the schools are using Google as the platform, and Google has Google Meet. And my son in middle school has a daily meeting with his teachers via Google Meet, and that's the platform that they use. I'm okay with that as part of your security program, provided that you've done the evaluation, you're doing all of the monitoring, you've done the securing of that platform, and you're managing it to say Google Meet is what we're going to use for video teleconferencing. You've taken into account all of the security controls and usability, and balance those two with that platform. That's what it's about.
And one of the things that out of that I've said for many years is that it's security's job not to say no.
Yes, exactly.
It's security's job to say yes, but these are the risks that you will need to acknowledge for using these platforms, and these are the risks you will use for this one, and these are the risks for this one. And while we're providing this one, there are some risks to it, but we've largely taken into account what those risks mean. Like using Zoom, if we think about what we use Zoom for at this podcast, if someone hacks our Zoom, are they going to steal all of your intellectual property?
Not so much.
Not likely. Not so much. So we use the appropriate technologies for things that have appropriate level of security.
Agreed. Lee.
So one of the things that keeps going through my mind with the don't use Zoom or don't use is that I'm used to an environment where researchers need to collaborate with people all around the world.
Agreed.
And when you're joining a collaboration with somebody else, you don't always get to say what the video conferencing software is. You can ask what level of information it's secured for, what the risks, but so I think these guys are still going to have Zoom in their environment because they'll work with other companies that have Zoom, or replace Zoom with Google Meet or WebEx or GoToMeeting or whatever the hell. You have a variety because you're not an island unto yourself. And like you said, you've got to secure those platforms. I mean, from the very basics of make sure your patching solution patches the Zoom if it finds it on a system, whether it's supported or not. Providing your users secure where you've accepted the risks for the business to use it, or you've got conditions that don't talk about these things on this product, and then you're off to the races.
Yeah, but there's two things that are really important. One thing I realized is that the versions of Linux that I was running with the versions of Zoom weren't necessarily auto-updating, right? I had to go get the latest version of Zoom, right? And until all this broke, I was like, oh yeah, like what version of Zoom am I running? And now I'm going to make sure that my patch management system flags that as an alert to say, yeah, cool, if you're going to run Zoom, that's okay, but you got to make sure it's the latest version. And the other story about Zoom I think I included in here was that version 5 has some privacy enhancements, not 100%, but has some updates. No end-to-end encryption, but they're enabling passwords by default in version 5.0. And IT admins can now define password complexity. And Zoom's waiting feature is now enabled by default on a single licensed pro Zoom account, right? So making sure that you're updated is one component. Lee, to your point, making sure that the users understand the appropriate technology for the sensitivity of the data and communications that they have, right? What we've always said here at Security Weekly is Zoom is great for open public information in conferences. If you want your communications to be more private, Nothing's 100% that we conduct over the internet, right? Or even not on the internet. Nothing's 100% secure in private if you're super paranoid, and I subscribe to that theory. You should be using Signal to conduct those private communications, whether that's text message or phone call or a video call. If it is something you deem as a data sensitivity level as it has to be as private as possible, Signal offers, in my opinion, and you can disagree with me, a much better level of protection. Still not 100%. Nothing is, right? But I think Signal does a good job.
But still.
I'd be curious if someone did a nice bake-off of all the complaints that are happening against Signal, if we did a comparison, a nice chart of like all the providers, and really they're all going to stack up very, very closely. You start putting the limelight on any of them, and they're going to feel the same kind of pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And with these home users, like how are organizations handling this patch management, where it's a bring your own device, or you took a corporate device that's normally available with some kind of patch management, or like a WSUS or SCCM component, like now that's outside of your firewall and your org and your network, that becomes a much different kind of beast. I'm curious if there are people solving that problem from a kind of a personal device aspect.
Well, and Tyler, what you really kind of sparked in my mind was it's a great opportunity for a company that has a video teleconferencing technology that has pretty poor security and privacy to come on and say, hey, like you should use us instead of Zoom, and do a bunch of hand waving, and people go, well, it's not Zoom, so therefore in their minds now it must be secure, when really it's 1,000 times worse than Zoom. There was one called something. There was another one like that, right? Jitsi was an open source one where we actually stood it up and tested it. Johnny and I tested it. I stood it up. It runs in containers. It's open source. So I stood up a server. I'm like, cool, it works. I'm like, but I have to leave the server now exposed to the internet. What vulnerabilities lie in this code? As we know, just because it's open source doesn't mean it's secure. And nothing against the developers that have developed it, right? But what kind of scrutiny has it undergone, and who's looked at it in terms of uncovering vulnerabilities? What is their policies in terms of turning around fixes that are related to security and patching vulnerabilities? What is their software development lifecycle, right? These are things that Zoom, being a publicly traded company and now a very vested interest in security, I think is better poised to deal with some of the security issues, and probably has a lot more resources than the poor folks, right, like working on the Jitsi project, right? Like, let's help them out. Let's evaluate their software and submit fixes and be like, this is the more secure way to do it. But my greater concern is, what about the kind of smaller fly-by-night that aren't Zoom? They're like, hey, you should use us, and people start using them, and really it's worse than Zoom or an open source alternative.
Sounds like someone's shorting some stock.
Yeah.
So,
Jeff,
I mean,
hold on. Jeff,
They don't need to short anything right about now. Sorry, Jeff.
He said Jeff. So for the hosts that are pen testers, let me ask you this question. Have you, to what degree have you incorporated Zoom attacks, or have you made Zoom a target in any of your recent pen testing exercises?
I would say, so VoIP has always been a prime target.
Wasn't the question.
I would say Zoom.
I'm going to let Tyler run with it.
Teleconferencing software, very rarely, right? Like, it would take a long-term engagement from a very sophisticated adversary to be able to hop on there stealthily, listen, gain enough intelligence that is useful to make a good argument against, whatever threat you're then using for the continuation of your campaign. Unless that's a very specific objective with inside of the red team or a pen test, very few people are testing those.
And Tyler, I'd argue that I thought about a scenario, where SMBs could very much wage war against each other. We had a scenario where I was working with a small to medium business that was using Zoom, and they were publishing their Zoom sessions. This was prior to the requirement of passwords, and they could have had a brute force, or they could have had a malicious insider sign up and get these sessions. They started opening these sessions up to like some trials and those types of things, and malicious insiders could have gotten into those. And anyone that participated in a couple of these trials, or one or more of these trials, or were a malicious insider, once the passwords were instituted, could have very easily guessed the passwords that were selected for this particular small to medium business. So
I'll go one better. I'll go one.
Have we implemented it yet? Have I done some testing against it for some friends? Sure. But much back to what Tyler says.
I'm trying to think back. I've had video conferencing accounts of one form or another, and I'm not even going to say what the platforms were, for probably the last 15
years. Gotta be.
Well, it's been a while.
Yeah.
They weren't always video teleconference, but they were teleconference accounts.
WebEx and Skype are at least 15-year-old technology.
And I am trying to think of an exception to where I was given an account. I have a standing meeting ID, a standing password. I create a meeting, whether it's video conference or a phone conference. I send it out to people. They log on. Very common. I mean, it never changed. So anytime anybody had ever gotten an invite, if they wanted to dial in and I know this because I might have used to do this accidentally, anytime you click on the link to dial into a conference, you're in, because it's all cached and it's all submitted automatically. Whether it was video, I guess in the earlier days it was more teleconference, but the same holds true today with video conferences. I don't see many companies. I mean, I guess now with the Zoom thing, they're starting to think about it, but to me, it's as much as process and how you use these things, and
Jeff,
rather than the platforms themselves.
Sorry, I want to get your take on this specifically, Jeff, right? Because Xavier Mertens posted an article, and he's awesome, by the way, rootshell.be. And so he says finding Zoom meeting details in the wild, and published a post that's basically some Yara rules to search for calendar invites that contain Zoom meeting passwords, right? Because if you want people to join your meeting and it has a password, you have to share the password with them.
Which goes in the meeting invite.
By default goes in the meeting invite. It's in clear text and part of the URL in some kind of hashed format, as I've observed. Correct. And he wrote
base
rules.
64.
Is it base 64, Larry?
It's base 64.
Oh, man.
So the password...
Don't ask me how I know this.
But now, and Xavier's done some great work here, but what I think we need to underscore is the password to the meeting is meant to reduce the amount of unauthorized guests, not prevent all unauthorized access. If, how would you cryptographically share, a secret with all trusted participants of the meeting? You basically have to give them the secret in order to get in. And how do you share that secret short of perhaps public key cryptography, where I'm not sure how would that work in the context of a meeting where you had to validate?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, the first thing I'm thinking of is change the frickin' password every time you do a meeting, which is not the default I don't know if Zoom's made that change with version 5, but that's not the default for any platform I've ever seen. You establish the meeting ID and the password, and it's yours. That I have an account.
Wait, does that mean it's two-factor if there's a meeting ID and a password?
Stop. But how? What would you do? What could you do? I'm not sure. I mean, if you're assuming that you're making it unique for every meeting, I think the question now becomes not so much. Again, it's not the platform; it's the implementation. It's how are you transmitting the credential to the intended recipients?
Right. And validating the intended, there's two different things, right? Securely transmitting the secret, and then validate. We've talked about this on your segments that you did with us, Jeff, right? Validating that the recipient is the intended recipient, and encrypting those communications to transmit the secret, right?
Right. But how are they typically going? They're going by email. Is the
in a
email
calendar invite, which is essentially the same thing as email, right?
Well, I mean, Yes, I believe they're coming over the same. I mean, I get my calendar invites on email, so I think there's some similarity there. But and I mean, it's curious that Xavier, which article are you referring to? Xavier.
I'm sorry. My story number 5 is Xavier Mertens. Yeah.
Oh, there it is. I mean, that's intriguing that they're out there. And how is he collecting them? That is kind of interesting. But again, I don't know if we said it on the air or when we said it, but Zoom was not. Zoom was intended to create a platform where people could freely and openly communicate real time. Lots of people all at the same time, kind of like the internet. Not with a lot of security in mind at the outset. So the fact that they're trying to put security in because we have this sort of new use case, if you will, that nobody ever anticipated. They're still doing as well, if not better, than most of the other platforms out there.
Agreed. Now, Larry, take me back in history. We used to use a chat communication that was it Jabber based that used OTR, off the record, which required that we exchanged public keys. Right?
Yep.
And now I still had to somehow verify that Larry was really Larry, right? And that verification was basically like I talked to Larry in some other mechanism, communication medium, out of band, and said, oh, Larry's like, my ID is this, and I'm like, my ID is that. Then we get in the system, and then we clicked buttons to basically exchange public keys. And once we did that, our chats were encrypted end to end. Right.
Or more importantly, just like Signal, that the trust key with Paul has changed, and you just click accept and
And Signal's different because Signal's tied to your cell phone number in SMS communications, which is slightly different from like a piece of software I'm installing on my PC or my phone. Right.
Right.
I think I was saying
you can reset those sessions and the key changes, and then you go, oh yeah. Apparently, Paul's key changed, accept.
Right. And apparently, Paul's still Paul, and he's really the Paul that I know, and I'm just going to accept. Right.
So there's one challenge with end-to-end, and that is when it comes to these video teleconferencing systems, we may be able to do end-to-end in a particular product, but then, Joe shows up with his really sexy room system, and it's connecting over SIP. And unless we have a vendor match, it's unencrypted over the whole way.
Right.
So now you've got a hole. Or better still, Bob calls in over the phone.
Yeah.
Which is totally not encrypted. If it's a cell phone, it's going to be encrypted over the air, but it's not encrypted over the POTS lines. And so it gets complicated fast.
Like how much of our audience knows what a POTS line is, Lee? Come on.
Plain old
telephone system.
Telephone service. Yep.
Service.
And arguably, maybe not.
I didn't say host.
Over the
I said listening on it. I had one more thought. How many of us have experienced, whether we sent it out or whether we've been the recipient of the same credential that's used, meeting ID and password that's used for a private in-house company call, but it's also the same credential that's used for webinars.
Yeah.
And public.
You're right. It's that. Jeff, it's interesting. Like it's the rotation of that secret that never gets rotated. Right?
No,
for the meeting. So we can only expect a certain level of privacy if we're not swapping out the secrets or changing the secrets, right? And then if we do, how do we communicate those?
I will go on record that I don't think encryption in the case of video teleconferencing is the solution. I think that the latency and delay and difficulties that are involved with using decent cryptography are not compatible with what people are looking for from their user experience. What I think is probably the minimally accepted and what should be done, and it's more procedural, is change the frickin' password every time you make a.
But Jeff, to that point, if we're not encrypting the communications, the thing that we can fall back on is validating the identity of who's joining. Now,
absolutely.
I mean, now we're still talking about.
That's different.
It is different, and we're talking about passwords, right? So, do I then?
Well, more generically, we're talking about authentication.
Authentication, and so I have to log into a system and validate I am who I am, And then
Right.
I'm able to use that meeting ID to join the meeting. If we look at our
Right.
existing technologies that are based on passwords, that's still a very flawed model. If you look at the threats and the attackers that are out there, right? I can be Paul if I know Paul's password, right?
Well, and I've been participating in I won't say a lot, but a few, hacker meetups, online events, cocktail cons,
Sure.
and gosh, I forget the name of them. I haven't been to a lot of them, but I've been to a couple of them. And the way I'm getting the credentials is over DM. They send me the credentials privately. It's not even over email.
Like a Twitter DM, which there is no. In my opinion, no expectation of privacy in a Twitter DM. We've talked about that, right?
Right. But there's not, but it's a different way to get it. And it's a probably lost lesson of security from the old days, but slowing the hacker down, making it more difficult, making it more trouble than it's worth for the bad guy, for the adversary, is just as legitimate as strong cryptography and making it difficult to break.
Well, you know what's interesting? Phil Zimmerman
Mhm.
developed not just PGP, but also, is it Zphone? He developed a VoIP technology that was kind of based on PGP. And I think that's something now that we need to, he's probably squirming in his seat right now if he's listening, jumping up and down, going, I solved this problem for all of you. Like, why aren't you using it, right?
He solved it 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Yep. The problem is, just like PGP, it's really awkward to use.
Right. And those are challenges I think we could certainly overcome.
Which is a legitimate but a very different discussion. But that's sort of why we're all in business, is because the user experience, convenience, speed, trumps any of the right level of security that could and should and is out there and available to be applied.
Oh, you want to join my Zoom meeting? Have you attended a PGP key signing party and validated your key? Right? Oh, so sorry, can't join.
Hey,
right?
That's what we tell Sam. That's what we can do at Layer 8 conference. We can do a PGP key signing party.
Can you do that virtually though? I thought you had to physically be there at a PGP.
Well, welcome to the new normal.
The new era.
Come on.
The irony of
Phil Zimmerman is so fired up right now. We need to get Phil back on the show.
The irony of, we can turn this back into our earlier segment with Steven.
Yeah.
Is that early on, Snowden actually was at a Tor party and asked Runa Sandvik, who was at the time was working for Tor, now works for the New York Times, to sign his PGP key.
Interesting.
Yep.
Very interesting.
That's the geek equivalent of getting an autograph.
It is.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
Great point.
Yep.
Other stories.
Find Runa's business card up here somewhere in the stack.
Hey, I dropped it in as we were talking about it. I happened to see an article where 8 video chat apps are compared, which is best for security. I haven't actually looked at it, but I'm like, it was germane to the conversation, so it's something that we can look at. We have mentioned the last couple of weeks slow news segment. I think Lee had it, and I had reference to it too. We're now seeing reports of breaches where 8,000 users might have had their data compromised. I'm like, when has that been a story in the last couple of years?
Right.
The threshold, it's like playing the lottery, until it gets to 100 million, it's just not worth it.
Agreed.
Yep. Although I got to tell you that I had something weird happen yesterday. In the middle of the day, I figure someplace got popped because I have a password that I've shared with just a couple of places, and you use one password a couple places and you have some variations, and we do the bad thing, and I had a couple places that didn't have 2-factor turn on, but I felt pretty confident in that this password was 22 characters long.
Wow.
And one of those was Amazon. No 2-factor, 22 character password, and I got an email in the middle of the day that says, hey, we detected some unusual activity. Someone logged into your account just a couple minutes ago from Australia. Like, really? 22 character password. Somebody got popped where I reused that.
Yep.
And I'm not going to say where, but
no, it happens. I got a message from a family member, Larry, that she said, "Well, this is actually my PIN number or my password," and they said that something like it had been observed using porn or it's tied to their bank account or something.
Scam.
Yeah, that's scam. And I'm like, essentially, you're part of a data breach. I'm like, just change your password and you're good, right? I think it does underscore the level of protection you get from enabling two-factor. And I do that on my, as much of a pain in the ass as it is, I do enable that on stuff like my Amazon account and things of the like. Wherever I can, right? And it's hard to cover every account. I mean, those of us that are on the show today, right? I mean, we've been doing online shopping and have online accounts for more than 20...
Two decades.
Right? For 20 years or more. And it's hard to control all that stuff, right?
Time to change your password.
Either you got to change your passwords and you got to enable two-factor, right? And enable two-factor. And thank God for LastPass. I mean, albeit it's not a perfect solution, and I agree. But that's really good, not in terms of just being able to generate passwords and remember them for you, but also being able to detect password reuse, which I'm guilty of not adhering to those warnings where I have to go in and change, my password reuse as well, right? Two-factor is a good backup.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hey, it's been this far into the show. PCI doesn't let you use, I think it's 10, any of the previous 10 passwords. Ha! Hey, can we shift gears real quick? I'm interested in getting your guys' take. I actually got this article from Chris Quebeca. She was asking me about it. My article number 9. I actually saw a news segment this morning, sort of a variation on a theme, but the use of smart apps, the use of public monitoring technology. The thing I saw this morning was drones, but basically the way they're trying to figure out ways to monitor the public to see whether they have coronavirus or they've been exposed, whether they have elevated temperature, flushed complexion. That was the story I saw this morning. But what are your thoughts on that from everybody's, there's a couple stories I've seen have, been screaming privacy. I'm just curious as to what your guys' take is.
It's
conceptually.
I think it goes back to our some of our off-air conversations with Stephen, right? Where we're talking about privacy and what really constitutes a gross negligence of privacy violations versus when we were in respects to COVID-19 talking about, well, if we could geolocate people via their cell phones, we could tell if there were gatherings of more than 5 or 10 people in an area. Now, provided that they're using the data appropriately, they don't necessarily know that it's Paul, Larry, Tyler, Jeff, Lee that are congregating. They could, provided that the data is anonymized, know that there are 5 people. I don't care who they are. That doesn't matter in this context. There are more than 5 people that are within a close proximity of each other, and that could be a severe threat to public health. In one sense, I'm okay with that, right? Like just knowing that there are air quotes people. You don't have to know their identities. You don't have to even know their cell phone numbers, right? That provided data is anonymized to a certain point, I don't think there's gross privacy concerns. The moment where now I'm automatically fined or my insurance goes up based on the fact that you knew it was Paul, that's where I get really sketchy, right?
Yeah. So I've got 2 add-ons to that, Paul, too, is that one, anonymized is really hard.
It is. No, agreed. Agreed.
And especially when you have a close relationship to the data.
Yep.
I'll talk about that offline.
Yep.
The other one is that when does using that data that's gathered stop? Let's say we eliminate COVID-19 or we get it as limited as possible, and these people are still using these apps on their phone that have access to do all this stuff, and when do they stop sharing data, and when do we stop gathering the data, and when do we stop analyzing
when does it become a police state where oh, there's more than 10 people gathering, that means they're protesting the government. And I'm not saying that's necessarily, hopefully never happens here in the U.S. or any other country, right?
Oh, no,
but in other countries that want to control
protest the government. Please do.
Well, the interesting...
but we saw that in the Ukraine, right, where they were protesting, and the Soviet Union was actually deploying IMSI catchers and text messaging people like to disperse, right? So we've seen that be used against people to basically violate their rights in those particular scenarios. Jeff?
What's interesting about that is, and I'm unfortunately I'm forgetting the details, but the article in the news segment I saw this morning, what they're talking about in each instance are adaptations of technology that they've already designed, and they're reapplying it in this case to coronavirus. So it's kind of a two-way street.
Well, but I think that's the difference between having a due process and checks and balances and not. And my hope and my faith in the system that we have here in the U.S. is that there is a process where there has to be a system of checks and balances, that in order for law enforcement and or the government to obtain that level of information, that there must be evidence provided, and that must be presented before a judge, for example, to get a warrant to pull cell phone records, for example, right?
So you're okay with backdoors and encryption technology?
No. I didn't say that.
No.
I said there should be checks.
Same principle.
Checks and balances to pull records, I think, is very different from providing encryption keys, right? I mean, that's a totally that to me is the difference, Jeff, between metadata and the actual data, right? And I think we have to make sure that there are distinctions in our laws here in our country, in the U.S., hopefully in other countries. Let's focus on the U.S. Distinctions between I have a warrant to pull metadata, right? That there were logs of this person called that person, versus the actual transcripts of that call that may or may not be encrypted by that person individually. Those are two different things.
Perhaps they're two different things, but the argument on how you do it correctly is pretty much the same argument in terms of checks and balances and warrants and going through a process for either one. I don't know that there's much difference in what you just described to get the metadata and what people are proposing to get the encrypted payload.
No, I think there is. I think that law enforcement needs, correct me if I'm wrong, law enforcement needs a warrant to pull cell phone logs, right? To get any, Tyler?
They do.
I mean,
Tyler's like shaking his head all kinds of different ways.
Go ahead, Tyler.
It really depends on what they're doing and what information is collected, right? Like the cell phone networks and the warrants that are required and or the agreements in place with those cell phone networks, where you may or may not need a warrant for certain aspects of information or data or preliminary information. Really depends on where you're at. Yeah, there's some interesting apps out there that are commercial and or like private apps that are available to both law enforcement, we'll call it data scientists, government entities that provide all of this data already. And it's being, in fact, not only metadata around like cell phones and the back-end networks that are providing that information, but then you start to talk about some of the ad tracking data that also has some of the very, very same metrics and information that are curated and then provided to, other applications and or other companies that you can subscribe to. So
I agree. Location, I think, is something that the lines are very much, I don't even want to say they're blurred. Like, there's shit that basically, like, if you want to track someone's location based on ad tracking data, Wi-Fi triangulation, cell phone tower triangulation, there's ways around that for sure. To pinpoint someone's location at a time.
and the data you voluntarily share by using any one of the devices, such as your iPhone or your Android device.
If you're a criminal or in the mob or whatever, like, you need to turn your phone off if you're gonna go to some location.
Don't even turn it off.
Or
you just don't
take it with you.
Don't carry one.
Yeah, because that location data. John Strand and I did a lot of research, into that. That location data is like basically out the window. I think where some of the lines are what the text message data streams and conversation data streams is at least much harder to obtain, right? And if not requiring a warrant by law enforcement to obtain actual text message transcripts, like what I said in a text message or in a voice call.
That falls under like wiretap laws and or warrant laws. So
which can go per state, right? Not just federal, but per state as well.
Right.
So there are protections, Jeff. I mean, they're not in terms of location. I think in summary, like not great because there's so many ways around it. But in terms of the actual data, there are more protections in place, and I don't want to be the person to say that anything's perfect in that scenario, but there are a lot more protections because of that. And it for those reasons that nothing's perfect is why I think we advocate for things like Signal, like PGP, that provide that end-to-end encryption.
And I think there's some limits out there too. I remember in 2013 when we went to China, one of the things we were told is that they would be reading our temperatures. We came in through the airport, and if we looked sick, we were going to spend 2 weeks in custody. Basically, we weren't going to be able to go into the country, and then we'd go home. And this is way before COVID. And I'm thinking, when it comes to some of these things that they're talking about doing for tracking people moving around, it hits that same button of that's way too intrusive. That's more privacy than I want to give up.
No, I agree, Lee.
It'll be interesting to see where this winds up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a generic question. We have all these concerns about all this new type of data. Is there any type of legislation that anybody's aware of, or any kind of authoritative body that is declaring what is considered PII or PPI in today's modern world? I mean, we talk a lot about it, but is there any governing body, rules body, anything that's actually trying to quantify or define what is PPI or PII, other than a bunch of sales and marketing teams for a bunch of vendors?
No, it's a great question, Jeff. I mean, short of our hosts that have any insight into this, defer to guests we could bring on the show to talk about these nuances that we've described. Is, your location data from, cookies in a web browser on your phone versus Wi-Fi triangulation versus cell phone triangulation versus your GPS location. Are those treated the same, differently? What regulations exist? And then when we delve into data transmission, what rules and regulations exist for various law enforcement organizations to be able to obtain access to that? That's a very nuanced question because they're all very different scenarios. And I feel like that criminals and legitimate organizations kind of blur those lines, right? Like when that app asks you, can we get your location data or not? Like what laws and regulations govern that here in the U.S. and then both in other countries as well?
Well, it almost sounds like ancient history, but in the early days of the internet, it was just your browsing habits. You know, what sites do you go to? Where have you been? Your browsing history. What we used to call big data, and everything that was collected to try to help retail companies selling you stuff to, give you the right ads, targeted ads, commercials. I mean, this has been going on for quite a while. But one of the reasons, on the one end, the reason I ask is because so many young people I know these days that are freaked out about privacy, and they don't want to let you know where they live, what their address is. Where, when I grew up, everybody's address was in the phone book, which was passed out to anybody. So there's certain information that historically was open and public information that is now viewed as privacy information. That's sort of one end of the spectrum. But then there's this other end of the spectrum where we've talked about our movements from a geolocating sense, but our actions, our behaviors, our habits, because so much of that happens online now, is certainly, I think we intuitively all would agree, that's information that should fall into the category of private if we care about it. But as a population, many of us, most of us, with the exceptions of the people in the security community, perhaps have willfully and unknowingly or knowingly given that away because we like to get the best deals, we like to get the targeted coupons, we like to get this, we like to get that, or we just don't know about it, or we just don't care.
Well, it's interesting, Jeff, too. I think many would be freaked out if someone put a physical tracker on your car, your vehicle, versus you being tracked via your cell phone and your spending habits and maybe your location, right? Like, what's the, there's, and I'm not an attorney, obviously, but I think that there are different laws that vary per state that say, can I, as an individual, track your vehicle and use that in a court of law, or use that in any capacity, versus I'm tracking your browsing habits. What are the differences in the laws and regulations between those two, when ultimately they could be the same goal or very similar, right?
Right. Well, I remember, I want to say early days, several years ago, renting cars, doing a lot of traveling, renting cars that had GPS systems. Occasionally you'd get a car that was, I forget what the term was, but the car physically couldn't go over a certain speed limit because it was tied to the GPS, and they would monitor. And I remember seeing that thing. Oh, geez, what's going to happen when the insurance companies get wind of the idea that they can track your movements?
Yeah, too late.
I don't know, for the last couple months, and it took me a while for it to click, but I forget. I want to say it's Tina Fey that does the commercial, but she's talking about, I've got my app on my phone that's tracking me, and so I get a discounted rate if I go the speed limit. And I'm like, holy shit, they're doing it.
My rate.
Yeah.
No, do not do that.
I wanted to
go ahead.
Shift gears.
I wanted to shift gears. Not in a great segue, but I did want to talk about shift gears is a kind of a pun intended. But Ubuntu 20.04 has arrived with the Linux 5.4 kernel. Of course, just in time for me to update a couple of my Linux boxes to 19.10, which now need to be updated to 20.4. It does carry with it, I think, at least a 5-year LTS, long-term support, for Ubuntu, being the latest long-term support release and most recent. It does carry with it 2 security enhancement. Well, 2 that I highlighted. The third big one is WireGuard is the VPN client that they've built in for VPN, but it also carries with it kernel self-protection, which I linked to an article about that from kernel.org. Which makes me think about how easy or difficult that is to bypass. And also kernel lockdown mode, which says when enabled, the new lockdown feature will restrict some kernel functionality even if you are the root user, reportedly making it harder to compromise root accounts to compromise the rest of the operating system. I think in my quick assessment of these 2 technologies, which are nothing brandy spanking new, they're just now being built into this latest version of Ubuntu, but help reduce the attack surface, but not certainly protect against all attacks against Linux systems. I was curious as to the other host's assessment of kernel self-protection and kernel lockdown mode.
I personally hadn't heard of them, but I can say that yes, the for me the 04 releases are the ones that are the quote stable.
Yep.
The .10 are the quote bleeding edge builds.
Yep.
I tend to run the 04s just because I want something stable.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, we're at the end of the life cycle at 1804, and I can tell you from a user experience and feature-wise, like 1804 is sorely lagging, which is why I went 19.10, and now happy to see 20.04, which will support some of these newer features, Larry.
But are we really at the end of life cycle for 1804? It hasn't been out for 5
well,
years.
I should rephrase that. Not end of life cycle, but certainly running in much older kernel with much older features.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Because admittedly, I'm still running systems that are very select for very select purposes that are still 1404.
Yeah.
That are still supported.
Yeah, and that's cool. I'm also taking in I have 3 Linux system, 2 desktops, 1 laptop, all running Ubuntu in some capacity. So I try and keep up as best I can, and I failed miserably with keeping up with the latest Ubuntu releases. So one of mine is based on an 1804 Ubuntu, and the other 2 I've just gotten to 1910 to take advantage of the more recent features. Now I have to bring those up to 20.04. Just for listener, I don't know where your mileage kind of varies, but my experience in doing the upgrade path has not been great. I tend to just rebuild when these new releases come out, and I have a much better experience. Curious to see if there is a really valid upgrade path from 1910 to 20.04, which has some of these features already, and including like laptop, like my newer laptop, the newer kernel that's in 19.10 and 20.04 in Ubuntu does better with battery life. So that's one reason to keep up. But I thought the security protections were interesting. I'm not sure how much that actually helps you in the real world protecting against attackers.
Well, what about what Apple's doing? They're going to get rid of support for system extensions in the future. You won't be able to do loadable kernel modules anymore. The heck with a module to prevent it, you just can't do it.
Yep.
That's an interesting model to me.
There was something in there about that, about kernel extensions too. And now the article's not loading.
That's one of the reasons why I've not yet upgraded to Catalina, is because the restrictions on running software has been so great that everything seems like a fight to get stuff that we want to use to run, and it's not even stuff that's like outside of the norm. It's relatively reasonable stuff.
Yeah. Even with 10.14, there's a lot more queries and vulnerabilities. Not vulnerabilities. Validation, approval, permission, whatever you want to call it, for loading things you wouldn't expect it. But it also raises the awareness, particularly if you got users out there that are prone to just install first and ask questions later. It definitely puts the brakes on and allows for the conversation to happen.
Yeah, so one of the things I noticed was that a representative from Canonical, which is the company behind Ubuntu, says that snap packages, which I've not been a big fan of because they tend to be somewhat unreliable, but I didn't know this. Apparently snap programs are confining applications to containers within Linux. I didn't know that. And
that's kind of cool.
What they say is they offer better security because what they state is a badly behaving app can impact the overall operating system. However, in terms of like reliability and stability of snap packages, I've not had a great experience thus far.
Yep. I don't know what snap packages are, but I've had some issues with DKMS stuff where it had to effectively disable the TPM, and then you go to image that system that had a secured file system that wasn't using TPM on one that had it, and it wouldn't work, and had to figure out what that was. And pain in the ass.
Snap is basically like the it's an app store for Linux, so it's like the Microsoft Store or an app store, but for Linux. Yeah.
Okay.
And so that will now replace the Ubuntu software in 20.04 releases now. Basically, if you use the graphical thing, all of those packages you install through Ubuntu software will be Snap packages. Also, it takes Python to 3.8.2 by default, which is kind of interesting because even in my experience, going beyond 3.7, even like, or you run into issues. Like not every Python application is 3.8 compatible, let alone 3.7 compatible, let alone all the stuff that's still 2.7, which they say is not installed by default, which is interesting.
Okay. But you mentioned the Snap package is supposed to limit the impact. Don't you also have to have resource management if you're going to prevent it from, say, taking over your machine? Running the CPU at 100% or something?
Yeah, and that's been I tell you what, being a Linux-based desktop user, that's definitely an issue you've got to deal with, is applications grabbing up CPU. Certainly Google Chrome is a huge, basically violator of that. PyCharm in updating on different versions from JetBrains, which JetBrains makes great software. Their IDEs are just, they're awesome. And I had some issues where, like, basically I had to like configure and reconfigure PyCharm to get it to a happy state where it wasn't taking up 100% CPU across all my cores. And I think that was just an update between updating my operating system and updating to the latest version of, in my case, PyCharm, where I had to go in and reconfigure basically PyCharm will like look at all of your, look at your Python environment and then look at all of your source code and do the mapping of like missing import statements and things like that. So there's a lot of CPU intensive work that PyCharm is doing to be able to say, hey, you're referencing this library, but you haven't imported it, at the top of your code kind of thing. So I definitely noticed some issues in upgrading both of those to the latest version, OS and PyCharm, where I had to go in and say, no, like reindex everything and then like change the configuration and reindex everything again. And then it was cool. Like it would spike all my CPUs and do the analysis and then be okay. And basically just do the diffs from that point forward. So I did notice those issues. And it's definitely an issue with CPU usage on Linux systems for various applications. I hope they can fix that problem, with containers and limit that. But I think it's still evolving. Also, PyCharm is, I think all the JetBrains IDEs are based on Java. I was
going to say, isn't it Java?
They're all Java, yeah. So when you like run top, for example, you'll see Java taking up 700% CPU, right? Because it's eating up all the processing power across all the cores. And I know that's on my system. That's PyCharm doing that.
So Paul, switching gears a little bit, and we can knock through these pretty quickly because I know we're getting a little bit long in the tooth.
Agreed.
I posted a bunch of stuff that became O-Days this week, specifically iOS no-click. 0 days.
It's a good one. In the iOS mail app, right? You email someone a link. Yeah.
Android Bluetooth no-click 0 days.
Yeah.
A CVS 10.0 listing for VMware vCenter, where POC code was released, and an IBM 0 day was released 4 days after notification, because the form letter that came back from IBM basically said, we're not going to do anything about this, which was a really bad miscommunication on IBM's part.
Interesting. IBM Data Risk Manager, their enterprise security tools. I hadn't heard of that one before.
Yeah, me either. But like, somebody found a bug in it. Found pretty serious one. They notified, my understanding, via HackerOne, for the authentication mechanism, and IBM wrote back and said, "Yeah, okay, thanks, we got it. No big deal. We're not going to patch it."
One I wanted to hit quick is the NSA shares a list of vulnerabilities in commonly exploited software to plant web shells If you scroll down almost to the middle of the article, they do list the software and CVEs and the release date. The most recent one is the Citrix Gateway Application Delivery Controller and SD-WAN vulnerability released on January 22nd of 2020 as being exploited for web shells. Also, Microsoft SharePoint, a WordPress plugin, Adobe Cold Fusion, Exchange Server from March 10th of 2020.
Yeah.
So a pretty good list of things. And again, I don't like to say like we shouldn't use this software or this particular software just because of vulnerabilities. We should patch it. But this list, when I looked at it, I'm like, yeah, you should probably take these CVEs and make sure that you're patching them in your organization.
I thought Cold Fusion was dead and gone.
I thought it would, yeah. But so here's the thing, Lee. It's a great point. And I think about this, all the time when we look at vulnerabilities. I'm like, who's still using, when you ask the question, who's still using this? There are enterprises that have built pretty large applications based on this technology and can't just flip a switch. Look, I'm guilty of it too. We've got an app that's built on Python 2.7. Like, I can't just flip a switch and flip it to 3, right? And that's how things like Python 2.7 and Adobe Cold Fusion and these other things end up out there and in use today without an easy path to replace them with newer versions.
Well, yeah, no, I was reacting to Cold Fusion because I remembered I thought it was quite a few years ago that it was dead and dying. But I totally agree. You build infrastructure on a platform, ripping it out and putting a new one in, whether it's Python 2 to 3 or Cold Fusion to a LAMP solution or whatever the hell. That's a lot of work and a lot of risk.
Yep.
And it's not broken.
Right. That's the thing.
I
mean, our internal app PP works, right? Look, I'll say it on the air. It's Python 2.7. It's 10,000 plus lines of code. You want to lend a hand? I'm happy to happy to accept it. We're working on building a new version. That doesn't happen overnight, but flipping that to Python 2.7 is a significant amount of work. Now it kind of makes me think I should try and see, just like scope that out, how much work that really is in a branch, right? But if you've got a project that you've published for security that is less than 5,000 lines of code, maybe that's less than 1,000 lines of code, converting that to 3 is not horrible. And I've done that, right? Like, it's not terrible at all. It's not a lot of work. When you get above 10,000 lines of code, especially in Python, a lot of aspects of that game change, right? A lot of the way you have to write code changes, and your upgrade path certainly changes, right? Once you cross that threshold. So I kind of sympathize with people that are like, yeah, I've got, maybe 10,000 lines of an app that runs in Cold Fusion. I can't just flip a switch and turn it into something else, right?
No, you
can't.
I
have a question.
Yes, Jeff.
I'm trying to answer it by reading through the article, but I'll throw it out there. Intuitively, when you saw this article, are you thinking, well, gee, what are these vulnerabilities, CVEs that NSA has listed? I was curious as to what their risk ranking was, and if they're of a particular ranking, high, critical, or whatever. My question is, how do you think the typical reader of this article is going to view these vulnerabilities because NSA says they're bad versus whatever their CVE ranking was in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. I think that there's probably thousands of vulnerabilities that carry a CVSS score of 8.0 or more. And what this article did for me is break it down to about a dozen that are being actively exploited. That could help me in my prioritization.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, ideally, I don't have, these critical vulnerabilities, right? But
so NSA, do you think, is getting into the we talked about it. Was it last week between Qualys and Rapid7 and Tenable? The whole prioritization game. Worry about these first because we're seeing them in the wild, which at one level I think is legitimate, and
I agree. Yeah, I'm on the fence too on that. I'm not sure how NSA came to publish this and how they're collecting their intelligence on
legally.
these.
That's how they're doing it.
Legally, or yeah, one could speculate. I don't know how they are doing that. I'd like to assume it is legally, and they're publishing this for the greater good. I would, if I was a larger enterprise, right, and had a lot of applications, I would take this as a data point and maybe cross-reference that with other threat intelligence lists, and then cross-reference that with what I actually have as software. And maybe it helps use that then as a data point to help prioritize my remediation efforts.
So sometime we need to have a conversation on CVSS and CVE scoring, and I think we would all agree it's not effective. But what can we do to improve it? Because it's not good enough for PCI to say, patch your systems, within 30 days of release of the patch for critical high vulnerabilities, whatever their criteria is.
Right. Yeah, and what if one of these vulnerabilities is a 7.8, not an 8.0, right?
Right.
That's what I liked about this list. It didn't say, it wasn't based on criticality. It was based on what was being observed. On the flip side, could be a 10.0, but when I look at my code, I go, that vulnerability exists in this part of the library or application that I'm not using, therefore I am not vulnerable, right? And I think that those are the challenges with software security.
I just looked up one, and it had a score of 8.8. And I don't know if it's a representative sample or not. But if I was a good statistician, I'll take that one example and say, well, they're all at least 8.
Right. Yeah, and like I said, I've looked at ones even in our own internal app that are 8.8, for example. And then when I dig into it, I'm like, well, that's in this part of the library, and I'm not using that part of the library. Therefore, my CVSS score internally is 0 because I'm not using it, right? Like there's no risk.
And this is why interpretation of results from any sort of assessment is important.
Agreed, Larry.
You just can't apply a CVSS score by a finding based on no knowledge.
Yeah, like the first one, Microsoft SharePoint. I know in our own organization, for me, that's a 0 because we don't use SharePoint. So that's cool.
Right.
Move on to the next one, right?
Well, the other thing is, we've been having talks at work about how better it's not just the CVSS score. It's, I don't know, you want to say the exploitability and the impact have to be factored into the decision as to how much it matters. You can't take that raw score in isolation.
But that's CVSS version 3. I mean, they at least attempted to put all that into the score.
Right, but I think one of the other points is I got to know if I'm running that software or not. And in our small organization in Security Weekly, it's a much easier question to answer than if I'm a larger enterprise and, well, let's just say like Microsoft we talked about, right? I've got 47,000 developers. How do I know for sure if I've got that particular library and or software that's deployed somewhere? It's a much harder question to answer when we're 2 developers versus 47,000 or any point in between.
Absolutely.
And look at that vCenter vulnerability that I mentioned earlier. There was a CVSS of a 10, a perfect 10. Like you wish for that during gymnastics, but what is the context for that? Is that vCenter exposed to the internet?
That's a great quote, Larry. I love that.
But is that vCenter exposed to the internet? Like, you're fucked. But is that internal and you can only access it from a jump host that these clients can access that jump host? Like,
maybe it's still an 8,
a different
right?
metric there.
Yeah, it's still an 8, which in gymnastics is not great, but it's not a perfect 10, which would be exposed to the internet, which would be horribly bad in security, but in gymnastics would be awesome.
Well,
But
one of those
access
center
from
ones
access
was
from a jump host from that jump host is restricted from specific IPs for workstations or the VPN cluster. I mean, I might argue that that's less than an 8.
Right. Yeah.
And
Well, then you get
that might not even make your
No, great point, Larry. And that you get into the, data analytics that folks like Kenna Security provide, right? And we had them on the show late last year. That really take into account exactly what we're talking about, right? Like what is my risk score for this vulnerability, which is something we've talked about on the show a lot.
well,
I hear Lee in there.
I was just going to say it's even more insidious than that, Larry. I mean, it was vCenter 6.7 only if you had done an upgrade from 6.5. If you'd done a straight install of 6.7, it was not vulnerable.
Ah, great point, Lee.
But I also think it was an update to 7. Or no.
Yeah,
yeah.
Devil is in the details, right?
Yeah, my point was the details. Yeah.
I mean, how do you know until you try and go exploit it too? I mean, I think that's still a thing that we have out there, is that, like, not only do we need to find it, we need to see if it's actually exploitable. I mean, that's something that, Larry, 15 years ago, you and I said we use core security and core impact for, right? Like, is it actually exploitable in my environment? And I think that's also a factor as well.
Yep. And
so I got a partial answer.
You think about that from the 6.5 to the 6.7.
Mm-hmm.
Who wipes their vCenter infrastructure to go do a fresh install?
Yeah.
Nobody.
No. Nobody. No.
So I had a partial answer to my question. I think
those without backups.
The one CVE that I looked at, I found actually a Krebs article where somebody mentioned that this one particular CVE is not labeled as critical; it's labeled as important. Mm-hmm. And critical being the key word from a PCI context. Install patches for critical security vulnerabilities within 30 days of release. So what determines whether it's important or critical? Maybe all of these that NSA published are ones that are in the important category but not critical category, and they're saying, no, you really do need to worry about them.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, Jeff and I specifically, and many of us have been close, if not have worked directly with vulnerability management solutions and or processes, right? The devil's in the details, right? To derive your own risk score has to take in multiple data points. In go back to our kind of previous conversation. Also, there's kind of gut feeling. I mean, there's this vulnerability out there. Like, I've analyzed all the stuff. I'm like, at the end of the day, and I came to this conclusion very early on working with Tenable. I'm like, can we just fix it? Like, I know we have all these data points and all this stuff. I'm like, especially if fixing it is not a tremendous amount of work, I'm like, let's just fix it. Like, yeah, there's that aspect to it as well, right? And I think that's one of the things I get excited about in DevOps, and have integrated into our own environment here for developing software, is every time we build the environment, I'm going to update everything to the latest version, and I'm going to fix what breaks, right? And I'm going to change some libraries around, and if it breaks, I just went through this in this recent release, changed some stuff around. Newer libraries behaved a little differently. Could that have been a security vulnerability? Maybe. But I'm going to make our app work with the latest libraries, frameworks, and platforms, and I'm just going to fix it, right? I mean, unless it's an exorbitant amount of work, and then we're going to have to come back and make a risk decision. But in the concept of DevOps and constantly moving forward, like, let's just update. Let's just fix it as best we can.
What you're describing, though, Paul, is to add to your earlier statement of the number one problem is knowing whether you have the problem, whether you're impacted. So do you have the technology that the CVE is applies to? The follow-on to that immediately is, if assuming you do have it, what is the impact on your entire business operation?
Yes, that's a great point.
All your applications of the fact that that's out there. You're describing in a very small sense, you made some changes, it worked or it didn't work, but multiply that by 47,000.
Yep, absolutely. No, agreed.
And it doesn't scale.
But you know what though, and I mean they're a sponsor. Synopsys is a sponsor, and I have to say it's one of these nuanced things that I thought Synopsys did a great job with in terms of SAST, right? Giving the developer the ability to find bugs in code, but also bugs in vulnerabilities in frameworks. So in their example, I'm running Apache Tomcat, right? And Tyler, this is very much close to some of the stuff we've done recently. There's 4 or 5 or more different major versions of Apache Tomcat. What I liked about Synopsys' solution was they would tell you like, hey, you're running Tomcat 4 dot something and it's vulnerable. And the latest version is, I think, 8. Is it 8 or 9, Tyler? They're up to now. Is it 9? 9, right? They're like, the latest version that's fixed is 9.1 or whatever, right? And by the way, 4.8 is good too, right? And as a developer, I'm like, if I go to 9, that's, let's just say that like that's 30 hours worth of coding, right, to fix that. But if I go to 4.8, that's 3 hours worth of coding. And it's not, not the greatest scenario. I'm still running the older framework. But in what I liked about Synopsys was it let me as a developer go, hey, look, first pass, let's go from 4.1 to 4.8, squash that vulnerability, squash that bug, and move on. Then when later on I've got a bigger development sprint or whatever, let's spend the time, let's get our code base up to the latest version too, right? And that's where I think a lot of vulnerability management and application security software kind of falls down, is giving you kind of those options of like, how am I going to fix this? Like there's the immediate kind of upgrade within my same major version number, and then there's the major version update that may fix some more moderate security vulnerabilities along the way, but it lets me squash that immediate, someone can remotely exploit my application, versus going to the latest and greatest, which kills a lot of other security vulnerabilities, but not as severe. And so those are the nuanced things that is tricky and very specific to everyone's application, which if you have 47,000 developers, you've probably got thousands of applications, right? So it's not an easy problem to solve. All righty. Well, I think that's a great point to end the show. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Larry, take us out.
Over and